The Cold War, a period that has been mostly put to rest when superpowers sat across from one another, shaking their fists with ever more vigor, backing up their posturing with increasingly flashy toys and sophisticated technology as they endeavored to one-up each other repeatedly. It's a period that naturally attracts more than its fair share of attention from fancy machine enjoyers, and more often than not, the attention is directed firmly toward military machines. What is less appreciated, however, is that the perpetual one-upmanship competition of the Cold War also extended into civil engineering, producing results that were often no less grandiose in scope than their martial counterparts. And today, we're going to look at one such example, the Soviet Union's attempt to cook up a Boeing 747 equivalent, the world's first jumbo jet, for themselves, the IL-86. Okay, let's start by setting aside the term jumbo jet for the rest of the discussion and be a bit more technical. The IL-86, and indeed the 747 as well, are what we call wide-body airliners, a term that means exactly what it says, an extra-large airliner meant to really cram people in, with the commonly accepted definition being any passenger aircraft with a fuselage wide enough to accommodate 2 passenger aisles. This naturally meant that the IL-86 was quite large, measuring 60.2 meters in length with a wingspan of 48.1 meters. Now, to help visualize its size, you can compare it to better-known aircraft like the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar or the Douglas DC-10. The TriStar measures 54.2 meters in length with a wingspan of 50.1 meters, while the DC-10 comes in just slightly larger at 55.5 meters in length and a wingspan of 50.4 meters. So, if you picture those, you've got it about right. That size, in an all-economy 9-abreast configuration, gave the IL-86 a passenger capacity of 350. Powering the IL-86 were 4 Kuznetsov NK-86 low-bypass turbofan engines, each producing 127 kilonewtons of thrust. These engines were derivatives of the earlier NK-8 engines used on the Ilyushin IL-62, and coupled with 70,000 liters of fuel tanks, afforded a maximum range of approximately 2,500 nautical miles, significantly less than its Western counterparts. A DC-1030, for example, could happily squeeze just shy of 6,000 nautical miles out of its General Electric CF650C engines and 138,000-liter fuel tanks. The IL-86's flight deck featured a 3-crew layout consisting of a pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. This configuration, which was actually quite common worldwide at the time, was a notable step forward for Soviet airliners, as earlier designs often required a larger crew, including a navigator and a radio operator. The cockpit was equipped with analog instrumentation, again typical of the era, though it lacked some of the advanced avionics seen in contemporary Western aircraft. All in all, it's safe to say that this sounds pretty normal. So where does the archetypal Soviet weirdness come into it all? Well, we've actually already seen a little bit of it, and the eagle-eared aviation enthusiasts among you might have already picked up on that. For example, remember when we said it had 9 abreast seating? Well, there's a bit of weirdness right there, because both nowadays and back in the day, most airliners go for a 10 abreast arrangement in their economy class, usually in a 3-4-3 configuration. You can see that here in this old picture of a 747 from the 90s. This means that the IL-86 was weirdly roomy in the elbow room department, even in economy class. So, we know what you're now thinking. Oh, so its passengers had a touch more sideways room. How nice! But don't worry, that is just the start of things. It gets oh so much weirder. For example, did you notice that the IL-86 also did not have any storage bins above the central seating, and that the ones it does have to the side seem weirdly slim? Well, this of course contributes to the roominess of the thing alongside the seating arrangement, but this wasn't actually done for the passengers' benefits at all, but rather the airports. You see, Soviet airports were terrible, and that's an unfortunate fact. Whereas Western airports, even pretty middling ones in terms of volume, were well set to accommodate vast numbers of passengers, Soviet ones simply weren't. This presented quite an issue, because if they fielded a wide body and started trucking more people up into the sky, how were they ever meant to accommodate all that extra baggage without an expensive and extensive rebuilding of basically every major airport in the country? Well, the answer is you get to keep your suitcases with you as you trundle through departures, and then you chuck them onto the plane yourself before taking your seat, thus totally eliminating the need to construct all new luggage handling facilities across the nation just to accommodate the increased passenger volume that the IL-86 would allow. Building on that idea, a bright spark at Ilyushin had a complementary thought. Just get the passengers to chuck all but their most immediate essentials into the hold while they're there, and then we can make the cabin roomier and present this bodge as a feature. Genius. But there is more weirdness still, because you know how Soviet airports were, well, terrible, we told you that. Contending with that fact led to even more peculiarities with the IL-86. For example, the Soviets didn't really trust their civil runways to handle much heavier aircraft, so they incorporated a fourth landing gear at the back between the two normal ones, spreading the weight of the aircraft over 14 tires rather than the 10 that they'd otherwise have, thus sparing their runways from excessive load. Now, large numbers of landing gears are normal on Western aircraft too, but to find them, we usually have to look at the really big stuff, your 747s, which can happily weigh in double and then some compared to an IL-86. Take a look at one of the aircraft that we mentioned earlier as being similar in size to the IL-86, specifically the L-1011, and, well, how many landing gears do you see there? Yeah, it's 3, isn't it? And then there's the fact that the IL-86 had elevators. 3 of them, to be precise, which the cabin crew used to access the galleys mid-flight. This wasn't a design choice caused by a bodge, however. Instead, the clever folks at Ilyushin simply thought it was a better use of space than having galleys on the main deck, where they would eat into valuable passenger space. By using elevators to access them rather than stairs, the cabin crew would still be able to make use of those handy insulated trolleys that airlines always have. The IL-86 also made use of hydraulically folding out stairs for passenger disembarkation, because jet bridges, the airport ease for those tunnels that you walk through to get onto the plane, weren't really a thing at Soviet airports. Remember, those airports were terrible. We told you that. This, in and of itself, isn't that weird, and even today, there are plenty of aircraft that have them, modern Boeing 737-800s and Maxes being great examples, but they are narrow bodies. You basically never find them on wide bodies at all, the assumption by their designers being that they'll always be using jet bridges anyway, and the odd time that you can't use one of them for whatever reason, the airport will just tow external staircases into position. So yeah, the fact that they were such a key point to the IL-86's design and on-the-ground operation, pretty weird. And even the engines on the IL-86 were weird. Remember when we said that it used 4 Kuznetsov NK-86 low bypass engines? Well, it's the low bypass part of that which is weird, because starting with the introduction of the 747 in 1970, which used high bypass Pratt & Whitney JT90 engines, everyone knew that such engines were the way of the future. And if you're wondering what the difference is, do not worry. I've got you covered. Put simply, the key difference between high and low bypass jet engines is that high bypass engines push most of the air that enters them around the engine core for more fuel-efficient operation, as that extra movement of air creates free thrust, whereas low bypass engines direct more air through the core for greater thrust and speed, but with higher noise and fuel consumption. For commercial service, a high bypass engine is what you want then, as it'll still get you up to basically the same speeds, but use far less fuel while doing so. And yet, the IL-86 had low bypass engines. But why? Well, that would be because it turns out that high bypass engines are actually quite tricky things to engineer, and the Soviet Union simply wasn't up to that level of trickiness. So it was good old-fashioned engines that got bolted under its wings instead. This, incidentally, is also no small part of why the IL-86 had such a limited range compared to its contemporaries. And that should just about do it for our discussion of the IL-86's design, at least without going into the really niche and technical stuff. But we're pretty sure that most of you are not going to be interested in the fact that it used a hydraulic servo rudder trim actuator mechanism rather than an electric motor-driven one.
What?
Whatever that might mean. So we'll bring this chapter to an end and move on. The IL-86 has its roots in the 1960s and early 1970s, when Western wide-bodies were just entering the scene, with the Boeing 747 making its maiden flight in 1969, and both the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and Lockheed L-1011 TriStar making theirs the following year. In short, the Soviets saw what the Americans were doing, and they wanted a bit of that action for themselves. Don't think the decision was wholly one of chest-beating and flag-waving keeping-upism, though, because while that very much was a part of it, it was the Cold War after all, there was also a very practical element to their desire, because Soviet passenger numbers were exploding, with Aeroflot, the Soviet Union's only airline, predicting that it would soon be carrying over 100 million passengers a year, a figure which it sure enough hit in 1976. And so, the die was cast sometime in the late 1960s. The source is not clear on exactly when, but the Soviet Ministry of Civil Aviation stated that it wanted a large-capacity airliner capable of carrying at least 350 passengers, and subsequently ordering the country's various aircraft concerns to get on it. This led to all sorts of designs coming across their desk, with the most peculiar of the lot being a proposal by Antonov to turn their AN-22 military transport aircraft into a giant double-decker monster that could carry over 700 passengers. This idea was rejected, however, partly because the AN-22 was a turboprop-powered plane rather than having a true jet engine. This, the Soviet Union feared, meant the West would write it off as evidence of Soviet technological stagnation. Additionally, Antonov was very cordial with the recently disgraced and ousted leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, and they didn't exactly want him finding a way to stick his nose into any important matters of state. As for Ilyushin, despite eventually winning the contract, they actually didn't propose a wide body at all to begin with, but a stretched variant of their IL-62, which was rejected for failing to meet the 350 passenger requirement. Luckily for them, however, the IL-62 was such a well-regarded bit of jet-powered kit that they were given the contract anyway, just with the clear warning that the passenger capacity was firm and non-negotiable, and thus, development officially began in 1971. Notable examples being Genrik Novozhilov, a man with no small hand in designing the previous IL-18, IL-62, and IL-76, as well as none other than Sergei Ilyushin himself, who, as you likely guessed from the name, was the man who founded the whole bureau. He had actually retired in 1970, but a burgeoning interest in the edge-pushing project, coupled with the fact that he found retirement quite dull, meant he was only too happy to pop back into the office and lend his talents. And that pretty much is the abridged story of the IL-86's development. Those two and their subordinates got to work, and then in 1976, 5 years after development began, voila, the finished IL-86 took its first test flight. It was hailed as a triumph of Soviet engineering when it entered flight, but curiously, it may not have been the indigenous wonder that it was touted as, since it all goes back to a clandestine meeting of American and Soviet engineers in Paris in 1971. You see, they both had something the other wanted. The Americans knowing their way around a wide body, and the Soviets being clued up on supersonic airliners thanks to the Tupolev Tu-144. While making small talk at that year's Paris Air Show, Novozhilov and Joe Sutter of Boeing got to the matter of potentially doing a bit of mutual back-scratching, and with both of their respective governments being game, the pair later met up at a cafe with clear instructions about what they were and weren't allowed to share. With the pair soon running out of notepaper and resorting to sketching on their tablecloth, Novozhilov told all on working with titanium, a vital heat-resistant material for supersonic aircraft, and Sutter explained the rationale and methodology behind mounting the engines underneath the wing. Ultimately, we don't know just how much of this meeting went on to influence the IL-86, and the matter is still hotly debated by aviation historians. That's a legitimately tricky matter too, because sure, while Soviet jetliners before the meeting looked like this, so we might be inclined to assume Ilyushin ripped the idea straight from Boeing, their IL-76 did take its first flight 2 months before the Paris Air Show, and it looks like this. So yeah, I mean, who knows? At least until some more archive digging is done over in Russia anyway. The IL-86 entered service in December 1980 when Aeroflot put them in their commercial roster. Its inaugural flight from Moscow to Tashkent in the Uzbek SSR went off without a hitch, and from there it gradually became a vital part of the Soviet Union's domestic operations, slowly beginning to supplement its Tu-154 Forerunner as and when more airframes became available. Do note, however, it did not replace the IL-62, despite the fact that that particular plane was a narrow body that first flew back in 1963. The reason for this? That would be its range, or rather, lack thereof, which turned out wasn't just terrible compared to Western airliners, but also to the IL-62, which could squeeze out about 5,500 nautical miles on a good day thanks to its lightweight construction and disproportionately huge fuel tanks compared to the IL-86's 2,500 or so. Consequently, if you were flying from, say, Moscow to Vladivostok, it'd be all dependable that got you there. Really, despite the whole wide-body arrangement naturally bringing images of a long-range jet to mind, and many pundits referring to it as such, we're far better off thinking of the IL-86 as a medium-range jet that just happened to be designed to properly cram the passengers in. It also flew internationally because, don't forget, while we think of the Soviet Union as an isolationist nation locked behind the Iron Curtain, it had plenty of friends locked there with it. So the IL-86 found its way to Berlin-Schönefeld Airport in East Germany, Warsaw Airport in Poland, Bucharest Airport in Romania, and that's just naming a few. And on the subject of international use, we should also mention the non-Aeroflot airlines that used it, of which there were quite a few. The vast majority of them were airlines founded in post-Soviet nations after the Union collapsed, with examples being Armenian Airlines, Kazakhstan Airlines, and Ukraine International Airlines. But two of them were based outside of the Soviet and later post-Soviet worlds. The two airlines in question being China Xinjiang Airlines, which bought three of them in 1990, and Hajvari Airlines, Pakistan's first privately owned airline, which leased two of them from Aeroflot in the early 1990s through to October 1993. As for its safety records, at least as far as we know, because the Soviet Union wasn't exactly a regime known for its transparency, that appears to have been pretty solid, with the IL-86 not suffering a single known fatal accident during passenger carrying operations. An emphasis on the words passenger carrying there, because it did suffer one bad accident in July 2002 when Pulkovo Aviation Enterprise Flight 9560, taking off from Moscow and being a crew-only flight, suddenly went into the full-up trim position, which in simple terms means that the aircraft was set to tilt the nose as high as possible. With the pilots not having time to correct, it stalled and crashed barely a minute after takeoff, killing 14 of the 16 crew on board. It should be noted, however, that the Interstate Aviation Committee was unable to determine why it went full trim, so we aren't sure whether the blame lies with the aircraft itself or someone involved in operating it. And then there's the matter of how many of them were produced, which would be 106 across its 15-year manufacturing run, lasting from 1976 to 1991. To put that figure into perspective, the Tu-154 it supplemented had a grand total of 1,026 units produced during a 29-year production run that began in 1968, and the IL-62 had 292 units produced during its 32-year production run. All in all, pretty poor numbers then, and it only gets worse when you start comparing it to Western jets. For example, the 747 that it had been intended to be the Soviet answer to had 1,574 units produced over a whopping 55-year production run that only ended in 2023. Even the L-1011, which was a failure so bad that Lockheed completely pulled the plug on commercial aircraft production, managed to see 250 units made before the plug was pulled. Of course, in many ways, comparing aircraft made in a planned economy to those made in a market economy is akin to comparing apples to oranges, and there's also the fact that the Soviet Union began to come apart at the seams not long after the IL-86 first took flight, which didn't exactly help expedite production. Nonetheless, such comparisons prove the objective point that it was an aircraft that simply wasn't made in great numbers. So, had the Soviet Union stayed duct-taped together for just a while longer, it's likely that the IL-86 and its younger variant, the IL-96, which is just a slightly more polished version of the IL-86 that entered service in 1992, don't worry too much about it, they would have been made in larger numbers, but it didn't. And so basically every airline in the post-Soviet space started exercising their newfound economic freedom and just bought Western jets instead, with even Aeroflot's modern fleet using Airbus A330s and A350s, as well as Boeing 777s for its wide-body needs. The government of independent Russia, as the inheritor of much of the Soviet Union's aerospace industry once the wall came down, was unwilling to totally abandon its legacy advanced industries, however, and so it kept the IL-86 alive on life support lest it lose those skills altogether. It has done this partly by retaining 3 old IL-86s for military use, but mostly it has done this by refusing to close down production of the IL-96 variant, even as basically no orders come in, with a mere 33 of them having been built in total, that figure not being counted among the 106 IL-86 made, incidentally. Of those 33, all but 4 are used by the Russian government, with another single example being used by Skygates, a Russian cargo and charter airline, and the other 3 being used by Cubana de Aviación, the flag carrier of Cuba, who, because of sanctions, not exactly easily able to buy American aircraft. For years, that was the end of the story. And soon enough, it was reasoned by most of the commentariat that the Russian government would just pull the plug and give it all up as a bad job. But that all changed in February 2022 when the Russian military commenced its invasion of Ukraine. Nearly overnight, Russia was totally cut off from the Western aerospace industry, both in terms of spare parts and technical expertise, as well as, of course, new airframe procurement. Now the commentariat shouted en masse the IL-86 would have a renaissance, as Russian airlines would have nowhere else to turn. That enthusiastic chorus, though, it failed to appreciate 2 key points. Firstly, that Russian airlines all now found themselves banned from the airspace of Washington-aligned nations overnight, rather than just reduce demand for their services. Secondly, they could keep the Western aircraft they had already going by simply buying parts from other countries that were cordial with Russia, but that Washington didn't deem naughty enough to be subjected to full lockdown sanctions. For the IL-96, however, this means that its prophesized renaissance hasn't really happened. There's been the odd order here and there as legitimate needs have arisen for new aircraft, 3 of them to be precise. But that's it. Never say never, though. Should the current state of affairs drag on and Russia's Western wide-bodies start to age out of operability, it's within the realm of reason that IL-96 production might be properly restarted. Indeed, this is exactly what has happened with Russia's narrow-body airliners, as orders for them have really started to pile up in the last couple of years, with Aeroflot alone currently having orders for 89 Sukhoi Superjets, 40 Tupolev Tu-204s, and 266 Yakovlev MC-21s as of the time of writing. So, yeah, if those A330s, A350s, and 777s start to get old, maybe we will indeed see the IL-96 make a return. Thank you for watching.